Hey you guys, here's a sample rapid game that I just played this morning, and it's an interesting example of one of the kind of psychological, mental tools that you need to have in your toolbox for improving at chess, and it's that when you get an advantage in a game, how to hold on to that advantage and to go on and convert it to a win. I think this is a good example of that, so we're going to run through the moves. My opponent's rated 1350, I'm rated mid 1300s as well, so we start with e4, e5, and I'm playing with the Vienna game, which is 2 knight to c3. This will generally put your opponent straight out of their comfort zone, and it looks very exciting. Knight to f6 is played, and now I play the Vienna gambit, which is f4. My opponent brings out his knight to c6. Now, because I don't know my theory very well, the correct move is actually here, bishop to c4, putting pressure on f7, but I went ahead and captured on e5, and then knight recaptures, and then we've got d4. So if you've seen my video on the Halloween gambit, which is very, very exciting and sharp, then this is a bit like that. You've got these two knights kind of clustered, and then you're just going to harass them with pawns. The big difference is there's no f-pawn, so we can't increase the pressure by pulling out the f-pawn as well, but the knight is forced to retreat. Now I can't play d5 because I could have maybe played d5 because I thought this pawn was hanging, but no, it's protected by the knight, so I push d5 anyway, and that actually forces the knight back all the way to g8. So if you look at it, it can't go there because of my knight, or there, and can't go there or there because of my queen. So there's only one square for the knight to go back to. So now look, I've got this lovely strong center, and I've got a knight developed, so I've got a distinct lead in development already. Now I bring out bishop to c4. One thing we have got is a key thing in this game, and you very often get it in the Vienna, is this semi-open f-file. So I want to be thinking about getting my knight out, castling kingside, and putting my rook here on f1, looking at f7. I've got a bishop looking at f7. I can bring my queen out to look at f7. So we're looking for an aggressive game here. All good fun. So f6 is played. Now I did think at this point that maybe queen to h5 check might have been useful. That would have pretty much forced g6 to be played, which maybe could have further weakened my opponent, but it also allows this bishop to come out. So in the end I decided to play queen to f3. Now there's an obvious trap here. So queen to f3 prevents this pawn from capturing on e5, because then I would have queen to f7 checkmate. Boom. My opponent spots that, and in fact spots that by moving my queen I've undefended a pawn here. So case number one, when you've got an advantage in the game, don't be careless and start to think only about attacking, because you need to defend as well. So knight takes pawn, and this comes with an attack on the queen, so it's not much fun. Now here I've got a choice of moves, and this is a useful tactic, a useful principle that I want you guys to think about, and it's the idea of the multi-purpose move. So I've got a few things going on, right? My queen is attacked, that's critical. Also the knight is attacking c2, that's also critical, yeah? At the same time, I've still got this threat that if pawn takes, I've still got potentially that f7 mate. So, 3 things to think about. Now, it might be quite obvious, for example, to move the queen back to d1, and that gets out of 2 things. That gets out of the queen being attacked, and it protects c2, right? But there's a better move, because queen to f2 is superior, and it means that yes, I'm still attacking the knight, I'm still defending c2, I've got out of the attack, and I'm still on the f-file. Okay, so it's very, very small difference, but it could turn out to be a meaningful difference. Now the bishop comes out to b4, pinning my knight against the king. But it's a blunder, because black now drops the knight. So here black is thinking only about his own ideas and his own attack, and he's taken his eye off the ball and failed to notice that my queen move meant that his knight was under attack. There we go. So now I'm actually up a piece, although black has one extra pawn on the board. The queen now comes out to e7. That's helping to protect the bishop, but it also means now that there's two attackers against this pawn here. So maybe now I could have played knight to f3. What I chose to play was knight to e2 to add another defender to this knight here. I didn't really want the bishop to come in and break up my pawns on that side of the board. But so I played knight to e2, meaning that my knights are paired. Now, here's another little tip for you. Paired knights in this way, when they are protecting each other, can be useful in, let's say, a defensive capacity. But if you think about it, think about all the squares that a knight can cover. Okay, so let's colour these in. Right, so that's one knight, and here's another knight. Okay, and because this knight's near the edge of the board, it's only covering 6 squares rather than its maximum 8. It needs to be in this middle quarter, this middle 4x4 square in order to cover 8 squares. But even so, you'll see that one of the squares that each knight is covering is already occupied by another knight. Right, so it's not controlling maybe as much of the board as possible, but even so, in terms of defense, this is a useful move. But I failed to spot this double attack on this pawn here, and so black goes ahead and captures a pawn. Now black is 2 pawns up, but a knight down. So my queen is attacked again, and I move it back to f2. f2 is a dangerous square because it renews this idea. The queen must now protect this square. If the queen moves away anywhere, then I go in with check. Well, it's not immediate checkmate, but I go in there, and that will force the king over to d8 in this case. Now the queen's moved. Black develops a piece. Out comes the knight, and that's fair enough. And now I decide to castle. So this is aggressive again. It's putting 2 big pieces on this now completely open f-file. I've still got the bishop there, looking at f7 as well. So black responds by moving his rook over to that file. Now I come in with my knight. Now, I had to calculate this. What if knight takes and suddenly my queen is under attack? Right? Well, I figured this out. I figured it out, and I calculated that it was actually okay. Right, knight takes knight, and now queen takes rook, check, and there's only one legal move. The queen has to recapture, and now my rook can recapture. And now the king's got 2 choices. Either the king moves to here, the king captures the rook, or alternatively bishop captures rook. And black chooses bishop captures rook, and now I get the knight. So what we've done is we've exchanged a bunch of pieces off the board. Right? Material is unchanged. The material difference is unchanged. I'm still numerically 1 pawn up. But let's go back a bit. Right? To here, look at black's pieces and look at the active ones. Okay? He's got 1, 2, 3, 4 active pieces, and these 2 here are still stuck on the back rank. They've got no part to play in the game, and if this king is forced to move and can't castle, then it's going to cost black time to engage these last 2 pieces that are stuck on the back rank. So with knight to d5, look at what happens to black's active pieces. Okay, takes, and bang, right? So now I've got 2 pieces out on the board. Black really has no pieces out on the board because all of his remaining pieces are still on their starting squares. My bishop can come out easily into the game, then my rook can come out easily into the game. So this has actually given me a strategic advantage in the game with that exchange. Right? Black pushes my bishop and I just retreat it. Black kicks again, and now I make a blunder. Bishop to d3, and can you see what the blunder is? Well, my opponent didn't see it, right? What he should have played is pawn to e4, and my bishop has nowhere to go. All of these squares are covered by this light squared pawn chain, right? He could have simply won a piece, but he didn't do that. He didn't look at the board. He didn't consider all of his possible moves, right? He's rated mid 1300s, and he decides to come in with an attack on my knight. Now, I still really can't, I can't move this bishop anywhere. I mean, I could have captured this pawn, for example, but then my knight falls, right? So I'm thinking I'm in trouble here, because my opponent spotted it, but this is a nice in-between move, and he's just going to kick my knight out of the way before he goes ahead and captures my bishop. But in fact, I guess actually, I could have played my knight to here, giving my bishop, well, one escape square on f1. I should have thought of that. But I thought instead, look, yeah, I think that would have been a better move. So here what I played was c3, giving my bishop 2 escape squares here, knowing that if bishop took, I could recapture and that would be alright. But what my opponent should have done is pawn to e4, and my bishop's got nowhere to go other than these 2 squares, and then he could have grabbed my knight. So he missed that twice. He missed it on 2 consecutive turns, right? What he played was castles, and then I breathe a big sigh of relief. I move my knight out of the way, my bishop's got an escape. Now he plays e4, but it's pointless because I can now move my bishop. I'm quite happy to move it here. So if you think about the game now, right, it's very, very important to step back and not only to look at immediate tactics, but to understand in the context of what's on the board right now, the context of the shape of the game, what is most important, what's going to be critical at this point. Now, my opponent has got 2 extra pawns, and those 2 extra pawns are these 2 central pawns, right? My advantage is that I've got this extra knight on the board, okay? So, my goal now really is to try and get rid of these 2 extra pawns. If I can capture these pawns and maybe exchange off the bishops or the rooks as we go, then I could be in a position at the end of the game where I've got an extra piece. Sometimes it's preferable to have more pawns, particularly if they're far up the board and there's a threat of promoting them. Sometimes it's better to have an extra piece. Now, so I move my bishop back here, offering an exchange of bishops. Black comes in, redeveloping his dark squared bishop with check, and I simply move to h1 out of the way. Now he retreats his light squared bishop. I'm guessing he doesn't want to exchange material at this point. He's slightly behind, and he knows that exchanging pieces, trading pieces off the board, clearing the board when you are behind in material is not a good thing. So I understand this idea. Now I've got an idea of maybe pushing h3, put my bishop there on g4, pinning the bishop and really forcing an exchange. Although if takes, that would have left me with doubled pawns, doubled isolated pawns on the g-file. But I have that in my pocket. So I come out with my dark squared bishop, and this does 2 things. It attacks the rook, which forces my opponent to have to react and use his next move to protect his rook. The other thing is that it frees up my remaining rook to cover the whole back rank and add to my protection. So he moves his rook to the f-file. I move my rook to the f-file. You can see that we've both got the same idea, right? I want to trade off material, my opponent doesn't. In this case, he actually captures, and I recapture with my bishops. And now I've got an extra knight. And what's interesting about having a knight in the endgame is that if it can get active and if it can get like central and play a good part in the game, knights can go onto every single square on the board, right? They can jump absolutely everywhere if they want to, right? They can cover every square on the board. A bishop on its own can only land on 32 squares, right? The dark square bishop, it can only ever land on dark squares. The light square bishop likewise. So let's say we swapped off the bishops. I've now got a piece that can cover potentially every square on the board. Even if we trade one pair of bishops, then that is actually a significant endgame advantage for me. So black kicks my bishop, and I drop mine back to c1 where it's defending b2. He advances his g pawn. I push my b pawn to kick his bishop, and it comes back all the way to f8. I bring my bishop forward. So what this is doing now is it's preventing either of these two pawns from advancing up the board. Right? Black's advantage is actually these pawns. He should be thinking about how to push these pawns up the board, because the e pawn is a clearly passed pawn, right? That is the big danger, and that's my concern. Now bishop comes out, attacking c3. So I decide to push c3. I figure that this pawn chain here looks pretty robust and strong, and it would only be in my interests to bust that apart. Black doesn't go for that idea. He plays bishop to c3, and now I see how I can maybe win a pawn. Can you see the idea? Okay, what I do is I play b5, and I know that, say, if takes, bishop takes, and that's okay. But if we do like here, right, he's captured a pawn, I can capture, let's say he captures, I capture, he captures, and then my bishop can grab the pawn, right? There's a few different ways this can happen, but in the end I decide to capture inwards to try and separate his pawn chains. He captures with a pawn, I capture, he captures, and bang. Right? I've just won myself a pawn. And I calculated that in advance, right? So now his king starts to come forwards. His king really wants to come over to this part of the board where it can support his pawn push. This is black's chance now, and you have to be sensitive to the imbalances in the game, right? Black's great hope right now is these two very nice centralized passed pawns. There's no other pawns that can attack that. Okay, so I bring my knight in, kick his bishop, bishop retreats, and now I block at least the e pawn from advancing with bishop to e3. Now he could play now d4 if he wanted to. He doesn't in the end, actually. He brings his bishop out just to attack my knight, and I counter-attack his bishop because I realised actually my knight isn't really under attack because it's covered by my bishop there. Right? The other thing to remember is that if you've got both bishops still on the board at the end of the game, then you've got all 64 squares are covered. You can land potentially on all 64 squares. You can cover every single promotion square potentially if you've got two bishops with the help of your king. So I think this maybe was an error of judgment on black's part. Maybe he didn't realise the knight was defended, but it is defended. And now, look what we've got. I have a light squared bishop, and my opponent only has a dark squared bishop. Okay, so my bishops can zip around the board now to every possible square, and his can't. However, his focus is this. His focus is these pawns. So what I need to do is I need to find a way to cement my strengths and my advantage in the game while making sure that I prevent this threat, which is very significant. So he pushes the pawn, I retreat the bishop. He pushes a pawn, I retreat back to g4. Now this bishop is actually preventing these two pawn advances. This pawn can't advance because it'll just get taken. So now he's got to move a piece. So now his king starts to advance. Now I bring my king in. I would love to get my king to, say, here. But I need to centralize it so it can help with the defense against promotion. King comes in. Now I bring my bishop there with check, and it does two things, right? Multi-purpose move. Checks the king and prevents the advance of the e-pawn. And my light squared bishop is covering d1. So if this pawn ever comes up to d1, I can snatch it off the board. We also have to bear in mind that I also have a passed pawn here on a2, which may play a part later. King comes in again. Now I throw in another check, and now the king cannot come in nearer. It has to go here. So clearly c3 is going to be the best move. I bring my king in, and now I'm starting to sweat a little bit, because it's looking like this king could be pretty strong if it comes in here and helps guide this pawn to queen. The pawn now comes in, and now it's time that I have to calculate, right? So maybe one option is bishop takes, king takes, and the a pawn does a run for it. But I've got to remember that there's this bishop that can cover these dark squares at the very least. So I'm not too confident about that. What I do realise is I can bring my bishop down here to b3, where again it covers the promotion square and prevents black's king from going on to c2. So, but in the end, what I figure out is that king to e2 should work. And let's think this through, right? The pawn can't queen straight away because the king just captures. If the king comes to c2 to protect the pawn, I can just capture with the bishop, for example. Or the king comes to c2, I've got bishop b3 check, and now the king, but then the king would come to c1. But if that happens again, bishop captures the pawn. So I figured out that I should be safe in this position. Now the bishop comes in, threatening an exchange. Okay, so what's going to happen here? If I take, pawn takes, I can't grab the pawn. I could put my king in front of it. That should be okay. If my bishop takes, his bishop takes my bishop, and I can't recapture because I'd be in check, that wouldn't work. So I go ahead and exchange the bishops, pawn takes, and now I put my king onto d1. Now this king cannot come onto any of these squares. It can protect this pawn, but only from the third rank. Right? So what's he got now? Now he needs to be thinking about pushing the e pawn down, which indeed he does, pawn to e3. But now I bring my light square bishop down, and again I'm covering all three of these squares. So none of these pawns can advance up the board without being taken off. So the king now moves in, and now Ari the a pawn makes a break for it. So this king is really in a bind now. You know, I've got a bishop that's able to zip around the board, right, really quickly. It can cover a lot of mileage, and this king doesn't know what to do. I mean, does it try and grab this pawn, which it could do, but if that, then my king's going to come round and eat up this pawn chain from the rear, while this bishop covers all of that diagonal. So he's in a lost position now, and with my pawn able to go there, the king now can't stop it. Good rule to remember is if you make a square from your pawn to the final rank, if the king can get into that square, right, any of these squares, then the king can capture the pawn. But here I've got my square here, and if the king moves, it can't in any way capture my pawn, right? It can't stop me queening. So that pawn is going to convert. King makes a move, I throw in a check. King makes a move, I advance. Pawn makes the move, I advance. I don't even have to capture this pawn because it's blocked anyway. It moves again, and now I queen, and that's the end of the game. Okay, so nice little game. I think there's some good tactics in there, but the key thing is to develop the appreciation. And this is, you know, as you move out of being a beginner, and you know, what typifies beginners, just carelessly not looking at the whole board, thinking only about your own moves, leaving pieces hanging, all those kinds of things, right? So when you get beyond that stage of making completely unforced errors, one of the next things you need to be thinking about is strategy. Right? What is the key aspect of the game that is going to make the difference between winning and losing? So here, for me, although I had a material advantage through most of the game, I still had to make sure that these two dangerous pawns were dealt with effectively. And I had to stop, I had to think, I had to calculate and use some of my time just to make sure that the biggest threats were nullified and counteracted, okay? Because it doesn't matter how far ahead you are in material. If you lose the game, you can't win it, right? You can't win a game if you lose it first. So, useful lesson. Hope it's been useful for you. See you later.